Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today, which is about Wesley and wealth. I'm talking about John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. You probably have heard me say this about 40,000 times, but I went to Boston University, which is an historically Methodist school, and so every once in a while I had to put up with Methodists talking about John Wesley. And one of the things I appreciated about John Wesley was a sermon that he wrote called The Use of Money. Today is tax day, so if you need to stop the musing and go to TurboTax or call your CPA, you should do that now. But what Wesley said about money was important, in part because of the context in which he grew up. If we think about 19th century England, it was a time when there was still debtors' prisons, and his father twice went to debtors' prison. John Wesley decided as an early lad that was something that he absolutely wouldn't do, that he needed to think about how to manage his money, and as he grew in prominence as a preacher, that became more and more important. Wesley started off as a professor at Oxford, making something like £30 a year, which sounds like nothing now. Maybe we could think of that as something like $30,000. It was enough to get by in that day. And whenever he was a student, whenever he was teaching there was a chambermaid that made a massive impact on the way that Wesley thought about money. Coming from a poor family, there was a day when he decided that he would go to a gallery and buy some paintings or pictures for his room. So he had spent some of that money, was putting them in his room whenever the chambermaid came into his room, and it was a very cold day. And on that very cold day, he saw that she was only wearing a linen covering, and he decided, well, I should be able to provide her with some money so that she could get a better coat. But whenever he looked into his coat, he realized that he didn't have enough money after going to the gallery to buy that coat for her. He was convicted in that moment that he should always be able to have enough money to provide for people who were in need. And so that following year, making £30 a year, he kept 28 after some tight budgeting, and he decided that he would be able to give £2 away in charity. The next year, after he was a professor, after he started preaching more, he made something like £60. But he had already recognized that he could exist on 28. So he decided for himself, despite making 100% more that following year, that he would still live on £28, giving away more than he kept for himself. Over time, Wesley came to make something like £1,400 a year based on his preaching circuit. If we're calling £1 $1,000, then that would be $1.4 million. And in all of that glut, he decided that he could afford a few more luxuries for himself. Out of £1,400, he decided he could live on just 32, giving the rest away in charitable giving. And so he writes this sermon at one point in his career called The Use of Money. And there were 3 points to that sermon: that you should earn as much as you can, you should save as much as you can, and when you've done that, you should give away as much as you can. I realize today you might be giving something to Uncle Sam. You might not enjoy doing that today. But I want us to be able to think, as we come on the heels of a stewardship campaign, not that you should give more to the church necessarily, but how are we today supposed to think about the use of money? I know that's something that I've been musing about personally after some calls with my CPA and looking at our plans and those sorts of things. And so that's what I've been musing about. If you can stick around a little while longer, I hope you do, so we can talk about how we earn as much as we can, we save as much as we can, and we give as much as we can. Won't you stick around? So the first point that Wesley makes is that we should earn all we can. But that comes with some caveats. We should be compelled by a potential big paycheck. But there are other things in the column, the con column, that we should be considering when we look at a job that gives us a big paycheck. The first thing we should consider is our physical and mental health. Wesley's writing in the mid-19th century in England. The Second Industrial Revolution is in full swing. And so two of the things he says up front is that you might get a big paycheck, but you should consider that you might not want to work in a place with a lot of arsenic. What good is it if you earn all of the money, but you only have a few years to live? He mentions the same thing for lead smelting, that if you were to work with lead that could be vaporized or something like that, it's in the air, it's on your hands, that this is detrimental to your health. And so those jobs, because God seeks to give you wealth to manage and health to manage, we have to consider these two things together. Further, he says that a job shouldn't deprive you too much of food or sleep. For you computer programmers out there that Wesley was not talking about, your late night hackathons, maybe those are something that you have to manage or think about whenever you look at a big paycheck. So we should earn as much as we can, but we should also consider our mental and physical health. We also should consider that the work that we do is not sinful. What would sinful work be? The first thing that Wesley says very quickly in his sermon is that Christians are not to be pawnbrokers. He says it in no unequivocal terms. But when we think about pawn shops today or other work that's considered predatory or uncouth, we might need to update that a little bit. There have been large conversations within the Presbyterian Church about payday and title loans. And so if that's something that you're involved with, think about how this affects your neighbors. Think about what sinful work might mean. I think it's kind of low-hanging fruit to say that perhaps Christians shouldn't be porn stars or something like that. These were things that were in the minds of Victorian England. Another thing that he mentions, which I actually take Presbyterians in the past have taken issue with, I take issue with it today, is that we are not to be dealers in poison. And what did that mean in mid-19th century England? It meant that we were not supposed to sell beer and liquor. Physicians are also put in that list because they would prescribe medications like laudanum, which could cause addiction or other problems. So how are we supposed to manage the good and the bad we do in the work of our hands, even as Wesley convinces us that there's a time to think about our paycheck and the power that money has? So we should consider our health, we should consider the sinful effects of the work that we do, and finally we should think about the impact on our neighbors. Perhaps there is a perfectly good and decent job. Being a good family physician who doesn't prescribe laudanum, being a good teacher, being a good janitor, whatever the case may be, whatever you're called to do. But we should think about how those jobs affect our neighbors. If we profit at a neighbor's loss, or we recognize that our particular job doesn't serve the community well, that would be another reason to think that even though we could earn more, if we're defrauding our neighbors, if we're lying to our neighbors, if we're taking welfare or wealth from our neighbors, this would be another thing that we should consider when looking at a big paycheck. Once all those things are considered, though, there's nothing wrong with seeking a raise, seeking a promotion, seeking to be entrepreneurial. What Wesley is saying is that vows of poverty don't necessarily mean that we give up all paychecks or that we settle with low income. So even though Wesley was able to live on just 28 pounds a year, that never stopped him from seeking to earn more in his work, to seek new endeavoring that would help him to save as much as he can and to give as much as he can. And so let's think about that a little bit. If we've earned as much as we possibly can, what does that mean for how we save as much as we can? When Wesley talks about saving all that we can, he means that in a lot of ways related to our expenses. He says that at the time, I imagine this is true for today also, that there's a certain sensitive Epicureanism that is acceptable in larger society. That having certain kinds of clothes, small luxuries, these are largely accepted. if I could paraphrase what I imagine Wesley is thinking, I know it's what I think, is that whenever I look at my credit card bill at the end of the month, I think, how did I spend all of that money and where did all of it go? That these coffees every day at Starbucks, the desserts and the times going out whenever I could save a little by eating at home, those little things that chop up your bills each month, he says that we might as well throw that money into the ocean, because that's what these small expenditures do. How do we find ways, and I'm sure that you think about this semi-regularly, to save just a little bit more, to cut back just a little bit, knowing that a penny saved is a penny earned, and if you invest it in the right ways, that penny saved might be a penny 5 next year. Finding ways to think about how Christians process our luxuries, our extravagancies, even in somewhat acceptable normal conditions, is something that is awfully good to do on a regular basis. Maybe as you're filing your taxes. Knowing where our money goes, having some self-control about the luxuries we enjoy is good. Wesley says that we are to do this in a moderate sort of way. So he's not advocating the staunchest form of what other Christians in other arenas have practiced. Personally, I think imagining how Christians understand luxuries or produce luxuries is somewhat exciting. Back to this liquid poison that he tells us not to market, I had 2 buddies, once upon a time drinking buddies, who decided to open up their own brewery. Even though I didn't have the time, they had offered me a partnership in starting that brewery. What happened over time, again, thinking of what Wesley calls a luxury and a poison, is that they became heavily involved as small business owners in the small business community where we were, and in charitable organizations. So noticeably, they did a 0.5K charitable walk. It went from one brewery at one end of the street to their brewery at the other end of the street, which again is not 5K, it is 0.5K. And in halfway, that's 0.25 kilometers, they put up a coffee and donut station just in case you got tired. On that day, they were able to say that $1 from every beer sold was able to go to Connecting Caring Communities, a charitable organization that built friendship houses around the city so that children had a place to go after school, to meet with one another, to do games, to do workshops, to do their homework. And so by marketing in the fire poison, as Wesley says, they were able to do a lot of good as small business owners. Thinking about how we earn and save with some luxuries, knowing that it creates jobs, that it creates community engagement, and there's a way of giving back through small luxuries, is maybe not the most terrible thing if you have the mind to consider how that money might be used and how it might be used for the good of the community. So you have to weigh what that means for your budget and for your conscience. How do we cut back on some luxuries? How do we choose one luxury rather than another? Maybe it's the case that instead of the bacon cheeseburger, you go for just the cheeseburger or just bacon. Learning small controls in our life is a wonderful thing to do, because in every action and in every purchase, we can think about what is appropriate to give to God and what is appropriate to give to our neighbors. Which brings us to the third point. We are to earn as much as we can. We are to save as much as we can. And Wesley says there's no point in either of those unless we think about how we can give all that we can. The third point that Wesley makes is that we are to give all we can. It makes no sense to earn as much or to save as much unless we are thinking towards that farther end. What is the point and what is the power that our money has? It's the case that letting all of your money sit in a bank account forever and ever until you die, and then maybe not having an appropriate will set up or something like that, you might as well throw that money into the sea, so says Wesley. How we think about investments is incredibly important, because on the one hand, We can invest in such a way that all of our money is saved or tied up in the stock market, in our home equity, in other ways. You can talk to your financial planner about how you've done that. But we can also invest in people and projects. It's up for you to decide how you feel that God is calling you. Perhaps you choose to give your entire pledge to the church once a year, because to you it seems more beneficial to invest it in your own way, and then once a year you give your principal plus some interest to the church. Maybe you decide to divvy up that interest in a certain way so that you're a beneficiary and the church is a beneficiary. However you decide to invest, you're the person in charge of your money. So you can give weekly, you can give monthly. It doesn't matter how you choose to give. Wesley tells us that we're supposed to be thinking about how it's best for us to be faithful with what gifts God has given to us. He says, in a way that I would never say, it seems a little dated, that we shouldn't be confined or stinted to thinking about giving 1/10 or 1/3 or 1/2 of our income to God. And remember, this is from a person who, making 1,400 pounds a year, gave 1,320 pounds away. So we're supposed to give to God what is God's. And how do you determine that? Well, through prayer and through thoughtfulness. So how we give away and how we save, these can be things that seem to compete with one another, but they need not. If you can think about intelligent ways to invest that make a good social impact based on the companies you invest in, based on the ways that you invest, and you recognize that there is always an opportunity cost where you could invest in a straightforward scholarship to woodswork. You could give to the general fund of the church. You could create new programs that you want to invest in heavily at the church, like adult ed or the library are two things that come to mind quickly, even though I'm not trying to solicit your giving to those things. When we have the ability to give all that we can, I think it's important for you to consider the impact that you would like to have and the legacy that you would like to leave. I remember in my seminary library, the best section of the library with the best books for the things that I wanted to study was in the Clayton collection. Clayton was a professor who spent probably more money than his wife appreciated on books, but he did so knowing that there would be 5 shelves worth of books to leave to the library whenever he retired. That was his legacy. That was how he wanted to give. There are plenty of places that you've been, I'm sure, that are named after the donors and the people who choose to give. So whether you want to leave a scholarship, whether you want to leave a memorial garden, whether you want a wing on a building or a niche for the columbarium, these are all church things. Maybe you want to give to other things. Maybe you give to Doctors Without Borders. Maybe you want to help a struggling school with a new library or new books or new computers, whatever the case may be. If you know the goal that you have financially, you can save appropriately to meet that goal. Perhaps that means a lake house and a really nice boat, but it can also mean even more charitable things. It is up for you to decide what's faithful for you in the legacy that you lead. Today is tax day, when everyone in the best sense, and I struggled to talk about the best sense of taxes, but today is the day when we are required to give to the government so that the government is able to perform the duties deemed necessary in a democracy. That means the military, it means healthcare, it means education, it means fixing your potholes, it means a whole host of things that are required because our community has to be able to give so that the community benefits as well in the best sense of what we pay taxes for. The church is voluntary, but we have this strong passage in Acts at the very start of the Jerusalem church where it said that people gave so everyone's needs were met. Where do you see need in our church and in our larger community and in the world at large? you can be thoughtful with money. It is not appropriate to say that because money is the roots of all kinds of evil, that it is evil in and of itself. Money has the potential to do a lot of good because money has a lot of power, for good or for ill. So as you pay your taxes, as you talk to your CPA, as you consider your monthly and annual budget, I hope that somehow Wesley might be a help to you. How do you earn as much as you can, save as much as you can, so that you might give as much as you can, knowing that everything that we have, we can think of as a gift from God. Some of it is for our enjoyment, for our need, and some of it is for what can be really beautiful when we are called to help our neighbors in our giving. Whatever that means for you, I hope you know that the church is thankful and grateful for any amount that you give, even if that's next to nothing, and that the church as a whole, not just the staff, not just the finance ministry, but the church as a whole seeks to be as good a steward of any penny that you give to help our community. There are other organizations trying to do well too, and if you give to those organizations, that is a wonderful thing to do. So think about what impact you could have, because John Wesley said that's what you should think about. That's what he was musing about. That's what I've been musing about. I hope you might muse about that too. And in a couple of weeks, we might even talk about how John Calvin was the first theologian in 1,500 years to think that maybe we should charge interest on loans. So that might be forthcoming. I think there is a book coming up in Susan's book group, maybe this summer, called A Manifesto for Moral Revolution. There are some words in there that sound like they might be from Karl Marx, but they're not. They're from Jacqueline Novogratz, who wants to talk about what we might call compassionate capitalism, how certain investments can make a big difference in emerging and developing communities and in our own. So if any of this excites you, and I know you're excited because it's tax day, maybe you'll consider that book or the book group. Don't forget to click submit on TurboTax. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next Monday.